Meeting to order. Please rise for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, I need a motion to adopt the agenda. Is there a motion? Moved by Gillette, supported by Kraft. Please vote. Is there? Do you want me to just do a voice on it? Okay, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. Public participation. Does anyone wish to be heard? Seeing none, we'll close public participation. Presentations, comprehensive annual financial report for the year ending 12/31/18. We'll start with Director Smeagol, and he'll bring Plant Moran up with him.
Turn the microphone on here. So what we have for you today is the 2018 annual audit report. The audit, of course, is performed by Plant Moran. I am very happy to report that once again we've received the highest level of assurance that you can from auditors. I refer to it as a clean opinion, but it's technically known as an unmodified opinion. That's very good news, and we've received that type of opinion as long as I've been here. I don't think there's ever been a qualification of any kind. As you know, it's a long and exhaustive process. There's probably 6 or 7 of folks from Plant Moran over in my office for about 2.5 months, from the middle of April through the end of June. They do some preliminary work prior to that. It's a very extensive process and time-consuming. And again, we have an unmodified opinion. Good news is the general fund reported a surplus of about $4.6 million in 2018. The fund balance, as you'll see on a presentation from the auditors, is just shy of about 24% of expenses. And I have here with me, everybody knows Steve Adair, my deputy finance director. He is the one that coordinates this entire thing. All the credit for its timely completion and its accuracy of the numbers is to his credit. I'm extremely fortunate to have him as my deputy. He puts this whole thing together, and I'm very fortunate to have the entire team that works behind him as well to make sure this thing gets out on time. So again, very happy, very fortunate to have Steve as my right-hand man. And with that, we have representatives from Plant Moran, Dave Harrington, Lisa Mineta, Steve Bondar, and I don't know how many slides it is, 13 it looks like. So they have a short presentation. Yep. If you have any questions.
Okay, and so before they start the presentation, let me go ahead and get the motion to receive and file. Moved by Sauger, support by Lucido. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Glad that we could be here to present the results of the audit. I do, as Steve mentioned, have a slide presentation to go through. I'll go through some of our deliverables related to the audit, the letters that you've received, and then Steve Bondar, who serves as the manager overseeing the day-to-day process of the audit, will go through some of the numbers. We have a few just very short financial highlights to share with you as well. So first off, we have just a summary again of what is the end result. As Steve Smeagol mentioned, it is quite an exhaustive process that we go through to audit an entity of the size and complexity of Macomb County. But really it boils down to 3 key deliverables at the end that we provide to you as a result of the audit. The first is our opinion on the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, the CAFR. As a side note, we are still finishing up the audit specific to the county's federal programs. That's a separate engagement with a separate letter and report that gets issued. But today we present just on the audit of the CAFR. Again, we did provide an unmodified or clean opinion. which is the highest level of assurance that you can receive from the auditor, and is what you should expect to receive and have received. The second item we have is our independent auditor's report to the audit committee. This really is more of a summary of how did the audit go, and we'll present some highlights from that letter too. Overall, I'll say the audit did go well. We're always pleased with the level of preparation and cooperation that we receive, and so overall that is a positive report too. The last item we will cover is our report on internal control over financial reporting and compliance, and we have some findings to point out in that I'll cover. So first off, part of our communication process in the audit and part of planning is to assess where there are greater risks that we could find misstatements so that we can focus more of our auditing effort in those key areas. So we wanted to share with you what those risks are, and some of these did result in the findings that we have to report later on in our presentation. So the risks, some of these will be repeats from previous years, that we identified and focused our attention on, one being overall cash and investment completeness. Given the number of accounts and the number of funds of the county, that is an area that we spend a lot of our effort. And then also looking and performing some very specific tests on investments. We refer to them as alternative investments, and these are some of the more complicated and more challenging to value investments that you would see in the pension and retiree healthcare investment funds. So we don't have any findings as a result of that, but again, given the complexity, we spend an additional amount of time getting comfortable with those values and testing them. A recurring item for the county is, so the county has a December 31st year end, but of course, as you know, there are several funds that either have a September 30th, even a couple that have a June 30th year end, and that results in some complexity. And so we make sure that all of that interfund activity that's on a different time basis is properly reconciled. The third item, risk area we identified, relates to retiree health care. And the county's system of having the Intermediate Retiree Medical Benefits Trust, easy for me to say, and the Retiree Health Funding Vehicle for the Department of Roads. There have been a lot of new accounting standards related to retiree health care, a new one that was implemented in the current year, so this is another area of focus in the audit. The fourth item we'll cover a little bit later, our findings in this area, but we did identify as a risk this year and discussed with the audit committee prior to starting the audit risk related to accounting for the county's forfeiture activity and the setup of a new fund related to that. And then lastly, as a result of some adjustments and finding that we had in the previous year, we identified the accounting related to the Department of Community Mental Health as an area requiring additional focus. So taking a step back and giving you a highlight of the letter that you received that is our report on how the audit went. This letter starts out with just a reminder of what our responsibility is in the audit, which is to perform our set of tests, identifying risk through obtaining understanding of the county's processes and internal controls and procedures, and using that to identify any additional areas, like I just mentioned, that could require additional focus. We're not specifically auditing the internal controls per se. That would be a separate engagement to really give an opinion on internal control. But if we identify issues or deficiencies in internal control, we do bring those to your attention. We are expressing an opinion on the financial statements as a result of our procedures and whether they are materially correct and in accordance with the accounting principles that are applicable to a governmental entity. Related to the plan, scope, and timing of the audit, we did perform it as expected. As I said, the audit process itself was fairly smooth this year, so there were no surprises, I would say, in the course of the audit or previously unidentified risks or areas that gave us undue trouble. And then in terms of any changes, there was one new accounting standard related to the accounting for retiree health care benefits, which you'll see some expanded footnote disclosures and also the funded status of that plan now being reported and recorded as a liability in the financial statements. We are required also to discuss any significant estimates that are included in the audit, just because those are areas that inherently are more challenging to audit, since they require different techniques to calculate the balances and techniques for us to assess those estimates. Net pension and net OPEB liabilities are significant to the county. Claims liability for ongoing litigation requires the finance department to work with internal corporate counsel to identify the likelihood of the county having a liability related to outstanding claims and record that in the financial statements. Looking at potential property tax refunds, and then also, again, that valuation of alternative investments is inherently an estimate. Any other required communications we would have would be reported here. I'm happy to report we didn't have any significant difficulties dealing with management or disagreements with management through the course of our procedures. Next, I will cover the findings that we included in our report on internal control over financial reporting and on compliance and other matters. So that is a separate letter that you have that you can read in its entirety. This gives a definition of the terminology that we use to define a deficiency in internal control, whether that's in the design of a control or its operation. So you could have designed a great system, but if they aren't being used and operated, that would result in a deficiency as well. We do put them into two categories, one being material weakness, meaning that it's of more severe and more likely to result in a material misstatement, and a significant deficiency, which we would say is less severe of an item. So in terms of our material weaknesses, we do have two that we've identified. We separated between items that we identified, journal entries that needed to be recorded to correct certain account balances within the county as a whole, and then we separately identified that we also had journal entries that we identified through our auditing of the Department of Community Mental Health. Since that is a separate operation, has its own finance staff, we felt that those should be reported separately. Our significant deficiency is indicating that there was a lack of evidence that bank reconciliations were performed over the forfeiture accounts within the prosecutor's department. So we are also required to report, in addition to internal control findings, if there's potential instances of non-compliance with laws and regulations that we encounter in the course of the audit. So we do have 3 items that we are reporting here. The first one being in our testing of the prosecutor's forfeiture account. There are certain expenditures that may not meet the allowability requirements that govern the use of those forfeiture funds. We were not able to obtain evidence to support some of those expenditures, but based on the descriptions, we felt that they were reportable here as potential violation of laws and regulations. The second item is that the expenditures within that fund, since it was created after the end of the year, the expenditures couldn't have been subject to the budgeting process that would be required by the state of Michigan, since the expenditures happened before the fund was in place. The third item that we have relates to our review of expenditures and comparing those expenditures to the purchasing policy as outlined and adopted by the county. There were certain items where we were not able to obtain evidence to verify whether those expenditures were in compliance with the purchasing policy. So we looked at a sampling of items. Some we clearly could tell were in compliance. There were certain that we just didn't have, the evidence wasn't available to support whether that process was followed entirely. So I will pause there before we get into the numbers to see if there's any questions or items in those letters that could require further questions or discussion.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown.
Thank you. On the audit, letter to the audit committee, we asked that you look at the clerk's office after the transition from the new clerk to the old clerk. What, if any, where will the results be reported on that specific dig down?
So we did not have a specific mention of that in the letter, so we did take a look at some of the items. I know there was certain bank accounts that had not been reported in last year's audit that had not been recorded, and those now are properly recorded. And I guess I will say that if there had been continued deficiencies, those would have been reported to you in writing.
So as far as you know, everything's been cleaned up?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you,
You're
Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Commissioner Gillette.
Thank you, Chair. With regard to bullet point 3, the transactions identified during your testing which management was unable to provide documentation supporting compliance with all aspects of purchase ordinance, when you say you're unable to obtain documentation of compliance, is it because it doesn't exist? I mean, I'm sure you asked for the documentation and there just wasn't any available, or?
It wasn't clear whether the approvals had been in place in certain instances, and also just interpretive matters related to the purchasing policy, whether it related to a bulk purchase or something like that. I'd say these were items that fell more in a gray area as opposed to a black and white, cut and dried interpretation of the policy.
So would you be able to provide like just sort of an example of what type of an expenditure that could have been?
Yeah, so I believe there were vehicle purchases that, again, we didn't see them going through the full, complete policy.
But wouldn't documentation for that been available if you had asked for it, as far as it did or didn't go through the policy? I mean, couldn't whatever department purchased the vehicles, sheriff's department or something like that, simply say, here's what you need?
Yeah, and let me be clear, they were supported by invoices and they were legitimate purchases. It was
Right.
more a matter of the bid process and whether it was applicable to that purchase. So Steve, you might be able to clarify a little bit better.
The purchasing ordinance would require in certain instances additional documentation being maintained by the finance department. In our sample, some of the sampled items, this documentation was not available to us. It either does not exist or they did not maintain it. So because of that, we felt it necessary to report a potential non-compliance with the purchasing ordinance.
So how can you determine when something is potential non-compliance with something that is just non-compliant?
Well, so we would take a conservative approach with it. Without being able to see the documentation, we can't say for certain whether or not they were in compliance, but because the documentation didn't exist, we've taken the step to be conservative and report that to you, that in our sampled items, we were not able to obtain the documentation that would have been required by the purchasing ordinance.
Okay, and the bullet point says certain transactions. Is there a number of transactions, like 10? Or is there a percentage or something like that?
So we would have sampled 12 transactions as part of this test. Approximately half of those transactions did not have the required documentation.
Half of them? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Smith?
Commissioner Gillette kind of asked my questions. I thought I remember reading or hearing that there was about $1 million worth of transactions and $692,000 worth of them fall into this category.
Yes, and I will
So
say,
that's
though,
more like
that
70% of the dollar total, but half of the transaction numbers, is that kind of, okay.
yes, but I do want to clarify, though, in selecting this sample, we did skew it more towards those items more likely to have an issue based on our understanding. So it wasn't a random sampling, so I would hate to project that to a whole population.
And
do you
Steve, I
wanna-
know that you wanted to talk,
Yeah.
yeah, I might as well give you a
I
chance.
just want to
here.
make a point that the total of the 12 items that were tested, the total contract value was about 11 million, not 1 million.
Not what?
It was 11 million,
Not $1 million?
right, it was
Okay.
11.
No, because I thought it was.
So there were
I thought I
12
heard
million, there was 12 items,
12 items.
and the contract values of all of those 12 items was just over $11 million.
Okay, so it's way less than the 70%, but still 50% of the transactions that you did. So just the dollars versus
Right,
numbers.
dollars are a small percentage, but it's about, there were 5, if you want to get down to it. It's 5 out of the 12, so about 40%, something like that.
So I guess my question comes, obviously the prosecutor's, issue is being looked at by, way beyond us. So we're, that's being taken care of and looked at. Here, I mean, it seems to me, and if we have the documentation and you just didn't have it, it didn't come to you, that's a different story, but you don't have it. And there, I think John Shapka, from what I had heard someone say, said our purchasing policy is bone-crushingly clear. So it would seem that it would be clear, when we would see these dollars or these contracts or purchase. I guess my question is, if there's potential evidence of paying contracts that weren't fully executed by coming to the board in their proper context, is that, I mean, that seems like the issue to me. Like, we're not, I don't think anyone thinks that we're paying money to random places for no good reason, but it's just a policy thing that you guys are looking at.
Again, yes, clearly. So again, as I said, the purchases were supported. They appeared to be legitimate purchases for the county, under budget and all of that. It was more a question of process. But again, we want to bring to your attention if there's policies in place and we note that they're not being followed. So they can either be adjusted in practice, how they're being followed, or look at the policy to make sure that it's the right policy.
And since I'm up, and Steve, I don't know if you're ready or want to talk about this a little more, but we've talked about it in the past, and and I remember one time you said we really don't have a real good procedure in place. Because someone asked, how do you know at one point? I don't remember who it was. How do you know what comes before the board, or how did you know? And you said we didn't really have a procedure. So I guess my question is, do we now? And can you explain it a little?
What I will say in public is that the major thing we put in place was a workflow in our accounting system where every purchase order that's entered into the system for $35,000 or more comes to Steve or I for review. And then we make an interpretation and a judgment of whether it requires board approval or doesn't require board approval. That's the main thing we put in place.
Okay,
That was not in place prior.
got it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. First, with respect to the finding number 1. Most of these don't seem, to me, they seem like they wouldn't be material. The first finding, why are they a material
Correct.
weakness instead of a deficiency?
Yeah, so in this instance, there were, some of the dollar amounts were larger with these journal entries, and we need to look, when we have adjustments that we come across in the course of the audit, we look at them individually and as a whole. In this instance, the items in finding number 1, I would say, were more unusual year-end journal entries, or an unusual, I think one of them was some funding from the state that came in that was, the timing was a little bit challenging, and so it was recorded in the wrong period. So not day-to-day entries that were done incorrectly. They were more kind of one-off, unusual accounting matters. So I think
even though it's listed as a material weakness, you don't look at these as much troublesome as much as they were unusual situations.
Correct, and that was more just based on the dollar values that happened to be large, but the nature of the items, I would say, are less concerning.
Okay. With regard to finding number 2, which is you make reference to community mental health, I just wanted to inform the board, we had a meeting before this meeting to discuss this particular issue, and we have talked about a lot of different things on internal controls, and we have requested that they prepare a report for us on what they are doing to, and what they have been doing. They've been working on this to tighten up their internal controls. So I believe we're going to have that within the next couple of weeks. So I just wanted to let everybody know that. And obviously, you all know the forfeiture funds, that one's already being taken care of. And just one last thing. So with respect to the finding number 4 and the purchasing with the $692,000. Do you have a record of the 12 transactions you
Absolutely.
tested, and could we get that?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. Yep, thank you.
Commissioner Leonetti.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Steve, and you don't have to come up if you're not going to answer this publicly, and I don't hold it against you if you don't. You indicated with the policy you have now that you and Steve get together and determine which contracts should come in front of the board that are over 35 and maybe perhaps which ones shouldn't? Or is that kind of what I got from the statement you were making? Okay. Did you want to explain that in public, or did you want to wait until?
No, we look at it and determine based on our interpretation of the policy, whether it needs to come here or not.
Okay. So if it's 35,000 and over,
Well, there's exceptions and things of that nature. So
Okay.
not all of them necessarily need to come here based on exceptions, and then there's exceptions to the exceptions. So there's a little flow charts. I don't want to debate it real
no, and I don't want to
deeply,
debate
so-
it either, but maybe we could have another understanding of it or something like that. I think that would be safe. I mean, it doesn't have to be on the record. Maybe a printout, maybe an explanation of the flow chart might help. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and I have asked, that I've indicated to him that I would like an opportunity to meet with him on the side sometime to discuss some of those things. Commissioner Gillette.
I'm sorry, withdraw.
Okay, I don't see any other commissioners. Do you want a voice vote, or do you want me to go ahead and? He wants to try it.
You want us to
Okay.
go through the financial highlights, or we've got
Oh,
3 more
that's
quick
right.
slides?
I'm sorry.
That's the good news part.
Do I seem like
so-
I'm in a hurry today? I'm sorry.
That's understandable, understandable. Steve, do you want to walk us through them real quick? Very quickly?
Yes. This will be very brief. So the last 4 slides of the presentation present some selected financial information from the audited statements. Slides 8 and 9 present information related to the general fund's revenue and expenditures for the years of 2015 through 2018. On the revenue slide, revenue increased over that time frame from approximately $230 million to $235 million, and this was primarily driven by increasing property tax values and increases in miscellaneous other revenues, such as charges to other funds. On the expenditure slide, expenditures have decreased over that time period covered from approximately $243 million to approximately $230 million. The decrease is primarily driven by a decrease in transfers to other funds that outweigh increases in other expense categories such as public safety. The next slide goes in a little bit more detail on the history of the transfers from the general fund. This slide illustrates an interesting history of the transfers out of the general fund for the period of the last 10 years. Going back to the Great Recession, you can see that the transfers decreased during the period of financial recovery as the general fund weathered the impact of the overall economic conditions and faltering property tax values. As the recovery took hold and resources became available, transfers increased starting in 2014 and 2015. And this was primarily due to the county addressing deferred maintenance and other capital costs. This was including the central campus renovation. As those projects have started to wind down, there has been a corresponding decrease in the transfers over the last couple of years. And then the last slide shows a history of fund balance as a percent of general fund expenditures. It tells a similar story to the last slide. During the period of economic recovery after the recession, you can see that the general fund built up fund balance over that time frame. Starting in 2015, fund balance was utilized to address these deferred maintenance and capital costs. As those projects have begun to wind down and property tax values have continued to experience a modest recovery, we're now seeing a slight uptick in fund balance as a percent of the expenditures in 2017 and 2018. And that covers our financial highlights.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any speakers. Oh, okay. Chair Smith, and then Commissioner Hall.
Can we go back to the last slide?
Oh, I'm
Sure.
sorry, I didn't see that.
So when you talk about, and I just want to make and this sounds great, 23.7% that fund balance is percent of the general fund expenditures. Is this the total is this where we get into the discrepancies on how we actually calculate fund balance? Because I know that we had a problem, not problem, but a concern because, yeah, I mean,
Difference of
you guys,
view-
the actual fund balance that you guys say is the fund balance is different than as a percent of general fund expenditures, right? Is that the difference? Yeah, I don't know you know what I'm talking about, correct, with this? Because there's two different ways that we calculate general fund.
There are 100 different ways that you can
Right,
try
but
to
I mean,
look
there's
at
one in
that.
the Gatsby, I mean, there's one way, and we actually asked you guys about it last year, and you said there was, the one way that you say that we should, is this that way at 23.7, or what is it in the way that the Gatsby records say that it is?
Yes, so this is taking a look at fund balance, total for the general fund, but then removing the amounts that are restricted for
Oh,
a
that's-
particular purpose
okay.
and the amounts that are considered non-spendable. So this is really truly looking at the unrestricted portion of fund balance, which I would say is a definitely more conservative way to look at it compared to expenditures and transfers out.
Okay. Do you know what that number is with everything?
Not off the top of my head, but I can certainly, that's
Okay.
something we can
I'd like to
figure
know
out.
how close we ended up to where we were shooting for at
Okay.
the end of the year. Thanks.
Perfect.
Commissioner Hall?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could you go back to slide number 9 or page 9, whichever one we're calling it? That's it.
There we go. Expenditures?
Yes, on expenditures, you had indicated the reason that it shows such a decline from 015 to 018, if I understood you correctly, is because amounts were transferred into other accounts?
So included in expenditures is transfers to other funds. This would be like transfers to the capital projects fund to fund something like the central campus renovation. As those projects have begun to wind down, there have been less transfers to other funds over this time period. Therefore, the total expenditure number has come down. Those projects have completed, so there's been less of a need to transfer to other funds.
So anywhere in the presentation, is there a number that shows in 2015, the general fund expenditures were A, and 2018, they're now B? Is there anywhere that number exists?
Yeah, so on top of the bars, you'll see, for example, in 2015, total expenditures, this is including those transfers, is $243 million. In 2018, it would be $230 million.
But it doesn't show me what was transferred out in 2015.
That would be below. So in the legend, there'll be transfers to other funds.
Okay,
82.2 million.
Yep.
okay. So it was 82.2 million in 2015 and 46 in 2018.
Correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Gillette?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm trying to, staying on the same page that Commissioner Haw just addressed, I'm trying to reconcile in my mind our budgets that we've approved versus the general fund expenditure graph that we have here. And Steve, correct me if you're wrong, but didn't our budget go up like 5% or something like that from previous year, the most recent budget, yet these expenditures show it going down? How am I just seeing two different, being
If
interpreted
you remember
differently?
the conversation about the 6%, I think that was all funds, all combined. And then I came here and I kind of did a reconciliation of certain one-time things and differences, and it went up 3% or something like that. It didn't, 6%, I believe, was all funds
Yeah, I mean,
countywide. No, this
we
is
had a
just general
bump in
fund.
funds from, the new road funding formula, for example, that
Right.
dramatically, but wouldn't that be reflected in this chart as expenditures going up, even though we're getting state funds and we're getting more of them?
No, because this is general fund only.
Just the general fund.
This is
So
general
this
fund
doesn't
only.
Okay, this is general
General
fund
fund
only.
only.
So,
So you may not see that depending on, a large portion of the general fund expenses are personnel related. So if you have vacancies, you're going to have budgetary savings that don't appear here because these are actual expenses.
okay, so what you're saying is that we may have budgeted for a 3% increase in spending, but because of vacancies and other things,
Or other
it
things
isn't a
we-
3%
right.
increase, it's actually a decrease.
Right. And that would have been for this year. I don't remember what the percentage increase was between 2017 and 2018, which is the year that's being audited, so.
Okay.
I-
No, that does help. I mean, it was a relatively narrow gap, but it helps to understand that. I was just trying to
Right.
reconcile
And
it.
if I may just interject, two things on the fund balance question, Commissioner Smith. So the calculation that's been performed by the auditors was, well, that's the same formula that's used by the rating agencies, just to let you know, so that excludes the prepaid expenses, and there's a long-term receivable to Martha T. Berry,
Which would have actually made that number bigger.
about a point and a half higher.
Okay.
It's about a point and a half higher, about 25.2.
Got it. All right, thanks. That was what you guys just explained to me.
Oh, yeah, but I have you on the list after, Oh, okay. Okay, then I don't have anybody on the list. Are you not done yet, Commissioner
I'm going to
Gillette?
ask something that I probably shouldn't.
Okay,
Well,
think about it.
it's simply this. There's a few members of the board who've been, including myself, concerned about, a contract that we approved for research done on for the upcoming jail project, and then a series of checks that were written that increased that expenditure by 70%. All the checks that were approved on that were under $35,000, like $34,780 and that sort of thing. I'm not sure if that fell into 18 or 19. Did you encounter that in your audit at any point? Does that ring any bells?
My guess is that probably fell in 19, just based on the timing of everything with the jail, but that would not have been something that we would have sampled in 2018.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Commissioner Myjack.
Thank you. Just a quick question, and I'm not sure if this is the right question for now, but I'll ask it anyways. Last year in a vote, I was one of a few commissioners that voted no on the budget. My concern was that, because we took, I believe, about $8 million out of surplus to help balance the budget, and I'm just wondering, either through Steve or our accountants here, how do these two charts, pages 8 and 9, that for the general fund, how does that relate to the county? How would you interpret that in terms of the county's fiscal budget, if we're in the red or the black? Or is that not the right question to ask?
So we haven't done a comparison to budget, so I
Okay.
think in that regard, I'd have to defer to Steve, or
Okay.
we certainly can add that to future presentations to look at comparison to budget.
Okay.
I mean, I think in terms of fiscal health, we typically look at that fund balance at the end of the year as comparison to expenditures, because that gives you an idea of what some refer to it as a rainy day fund, but
Right.
what you have set aside that
Right.
can be used for future purposes. So we see that as Steve described, consistent for the past few years, and definitely know that there's been deliberate focus placed on that and maintaining that level of fund balance.
All right. Do you have anything to add on that at all, Steve? No? Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other speakers, so please vote.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Motion passes 12-0. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We
Thank you.
appreciate your time.
Okay, Finance Department's quarterly report, and we'll have Director Smeagol up, and I'll go ahead and seek a motion to receive and file. Moved by Haas, supported by Kraft. Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
As normal with the quarterly report, I don't have a lot of detailed comments. I'm open for any questions. Again, the main thing that I try to focus on, in particular in the general fund, is how we're progressing with our personnel expenses, since it's such a large percentage of the budget in the general fund. And as of June 30th and as of July 31st, we appear to be meeting our turnover goal of 3.5%, which has been ratcheting down in past, the last few years. So we're doing good in that regard. To some extent, halfway through the year is somewhat early in some regard to kind of project what's going on by the end of the year. My intention is, as I did for the third quarter report last year, to kind of give you a projection throughout the remainder of the year. I do have some good news to share that I will be coming to the board in September with, and that are some revenue adjustments that I did last year. I did similar things last year with property taxes, interest earnings. I think there was real estate transfer tax. Similar issue this year. We received a supplemental payment for personal property tax reimbursement that we didn't budget for. So there's some additional funding there. Property taxes, we know, are up about 0.7%, I believe, over our projection. Interest earnings, the Treasurer's Office is doing a phenomenal job investing the county's cash. So we're going to have a several $100,000 adjustment there as well. So that will be coming in September, so.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Carabelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I went and looked at it, and I didn't know how to find it in here. I'll sum it up for you, and you tell me where I can look for it, because on page 9, I couldn't see it. Last year, we approved new hires for the sheriff for the jail to reduce the overtime, and some patrol for the transportation from the hospitals to the courts to... Did it reduce overtime? And before you say that, when I looked, and this is why I'm a little confused, I looked on page 9, and I went to road patrols. It looks like we're heavier than what we should have been dollar-wise, but I don't know if that includes the new employees compared to the previous year, or is that overtime? You know, it's hard for me to look at this.
When you say page 9, Commissioner, if you can help me out.
I'm sorry, you're RV2,
RV2, good, I'm with you.
and you go...
And we're on road patrol revenue. So we're a little bit ahead of budget in terms of the billings.
But does that cover, you know what I'm saying? We added cost, right, by adding some new deputies
Should
to
cover the new
jail,
hires.
and we were supposed to see a significant savings.
But if you remember, most of the new hires we put on in the budget for the sheriff's department were for prisoner transport, hospital guards, and all that sort of thing. So when we add deputies specific for a patrol contract, then that revenue, that position
That
gets
should be
added
a
and the
wash.
revenue it's a
Okay,
wash.
then I'm looking in the wrong spot.
Correct.
So my question is, halfway through the year, and number one, did he hire them? Because I know that was a problem. Did they get them all on board? And is it reducing overtime?
We won't know about the
Point of-
overtime until the fourth quarter.
I'll say point of information, if you don't mind. I remember that he said that we were talking a period of training, which would
It's
not
about 8 or
reduce
9 months to get somebody
before you would actually
onboarded,
start
go through
seeing
training.
something.
So we won't even be able to determine any impact on overtime until the fourth quarter.
Well, you could have said that when I started talking.
Well, you shut me down, so.
Thank you, Commissioner Gillette.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Steve, I want to go back to the audit very briefly, and there's two charts that jumped out at me. One was the income, I suppose you could call it, with the revenue, which shows it's going up from 228 to 235 essentially, and that's easy to understand given the economy, investments, and so forth. But then the expenditures going down from 236 to 230, I think, is unexpected by me, and I think that we should all note that with a certain amount of pride, both in the administration and everybody else involved, your department and so forth, to not just achieve the easy part, which is better revenues in a relatively good economy, but actually having expenditures going down. I think that should be noted as something the county can be proud of. So I want to thank you, the administration, and everybody else involved in that process.
Okay, thank you. I think he was waiting for you to say you're welcome. Commissioner Leonetti.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Steve, it was about maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, we had switched around our health insurance the way we were going to do it for the employees, and we were looking to see if we could save on that. And this may not be part of your report, but do we have any data on that? It was going to take a while before we'd have data to see if we were going to save money doing it that way.
We do have some data on that. We're meeting with our healthcare carriers later this month, actually. So in 2018, what you're referring to is that we went self-insured on all of our products versus being fully insured for the HMO, the BCN and the HAP.
Yep, correct. That's exactly it.
We did have a little bit of negative experience, if you want, in the first year. Keep in mind, if we had not gone self-insured, those claims still would have been there, and they eventually would have caught up with us in terms of increased premium costs. May have taken a cycle or a 2-year cycle. It just happened to hit us last year a little bit negative, but we're trying to drill into why that is. I'm presuming we had some catastrophic claim in my office, for example.
Okay, fair enough. And I know it's still too new, but I just wanted to see where we were at on the data.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
thank you.
exactly.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, and Crystal pulled up the radar, and it's only raining on our parade, not everybody else's in Macomb County. So, Commissioner Ha?
I don't even know how to respond to that. I know she had indicated from Plant Moran that she hadn't reviewed the retirement funds. So I just thought I would put a little plug in there. All three of them are doing very well. The leadership is following them, and the return on investments have been very good throughout the year. So thank the chairmans for that. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other speakers. Please vote. I have a green screen. I don't know why. Motion passes 12-0. Thank you, Steve. All right, I need a motion to forward to full board military service time for, moved by Romano, supported by Leonetti. I guess I should say Laura Gold, 48 months. Please vote. I have a green screen. Oh, I didn't, that's my fault. Okay, that motion passes 11-0. Do we? Yeah, 1, 2, 3. But there's 12 of us, so somebody's missing. Let's see. Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, item number 7, ordinance for the 2019-2 2020 August year-end funds appropriation ordinance. Motion to forward to full board. Is there a motion? Moved by Kraft. Is there support? Support by Sauger. I don't. Okay, I don't. There are no speakers? Yeah, no, I'm not on it. Oh, great. Are there any speakers? No. Please vote. Motion passes 12-0. New business. Anyone with new business? Motion to adjourn. You have, do you want, okay. Moved by Haas, supported by Gillette. Please vote. Thank you, we're adjourned.